All right, let's go.
Number 12. Lingua Ignota. The first one. A 12th century abbess who built a language for God. The oldest known constructed language was not built by a linguist, not by a philosopher, not by a science fiction writer. It was built by a Benedictine abbess named Hildegard von Bingen in 12th century Germany. Around 1150 AD, Hildegard was one of the most remarkable people of the medieval period. Composer, theologian, medical writer, visionary. She also, apparently, found the time to invent a language. She called it Lingua Ignota, the unknown language. It had a vocabulary of approximately 1,011 words, primarily nouns, written in an invented script she called the Literae Ignatae, unknown letters. The grammar was based on Latin. The words were entirely her own invention. Nobody knows exactly what she intended it for. The most widely accepted interpretation is that it was a sacred language, something mystical, a private vocabulary for spiritual communication, possibly used in her religious community as a secret language connecting her followers to the divine. What makes Lingua Ignota scientifically fascinating is not the language itself, it is its existence. A woman in 12th century Europe without any linguistic training as we understand it, without any precedent for what she was doing, sat down and built a systematic vocabulary with its own script from nothing, 870 years before the term Conlang was coined. The impulse to construct language is older than the field of linguistics itself. Number 11. Volapük, the world language that destroyed itself. 1879, a Catholic priest named Johann Martin Schleyer in Baden, Germany, claimed God visited him in a dream and told him to create a language for the whole world. He spent one sleepless night writing it down. He called it Volapük, roughly world speech. Volapük spread with extraordinary speed. By 1889, there were approximately 200 Volapük clubs worldwide and an estimated 1 million speakers. The first two international Volapük congresses were conducted entirely in Volapük. Textbooks were published in 25 languages, multiple independent grammars, a real international community speaking a constructed language. Then it collapsed. The language had two problems. Schleyer's grammar was complex to the point of absurdity, 505 distinct conjugational forms for a single verb, and Schleyer refused to allow any changes to the language at all. His language, his rules. When speakers proposed reforms, he rejected them. The community fractured. Reformers left, some migrated to a simpler alternative that had just appeared, Esperanto. Within a decade, the Volapük community had largely dissolved. Today, it has fewer than 30 known speakers, a 100-year period of dormancy. A language that achieved unprecedented global success in under 10 years and then destroyed itself through its creator's rigidity. The lesson linguists drew from Volapük was direct. A language belongs to its community, not its creator. The moment a creator refuses to let a language evolve, it begins to die. Number 10. Esperanto, the one that actually survived. 1887, Warsaw. A young ophthalmologist named Ludwig Lazarus Zamenhof published a small booklet, the first book, a complete grammar of a new international language. He signed it with a pseudonym, Doctoro Esperanto, Dr. Hopeful. The name stuck. The language became Esperanto. Zamenhof grew up in Białystok, a city divided between Russians, Poles, Germans, and Jews, each community in tension with the others, each speaking a different language. He became convinced that a shared neutral language would reduce conflict between peoples. He spent his childhood and adolescence building one. Esperanto was designed for learnability, regular grammar, no exceptions, 16 rules. Every verb conjugates the same way. Nouns all end in O, adjectives in A. A suffix system where you can derive thousands of words from a small set of roots. An English speaker can achieve basic fluency in roughly 150 hours, compared to 600 hours for French, 2,200 hours for Japanese. What happened to Esperanto is the most fascinating story in constructed language history. It got native speakers. Nobody designed that. Nobody planned it, but some parents raised their children speaking Esperanto at home. Those children grew up with it as a first language. They developed friendships, romances, communities through Esperanto. The language began to evolve in ways Zamenhof never specified. Regional accents developed, slang emerged. Irregular patterns crept in because human communities always develop irregular patterns. As of 2026, Esperanto has between 1.5 and 2 million speakers worldwide, between 1,000 and 2,000 native speakers, a Wikipedia version with over 340,000 articles, annual world congresses held in a different country every year. The 109th was held in Tanzania in 2024, the first time the Congress reached Africa. It survived 2 world wars, Soviet-era persecution, the rise of English as the global lingua franca, and over a century of people declaring it a failed experiment. It did not achieve Zamenhof's dream of becoming the world's universal second language, but it became something he never predicted, and perhaps more interesting, a living community language with a culture, a literature, and native speakers, a language that escaped its creator. Number 9. Tolkien's Elvish, the one built before the stories. Most constructed languages in fiction are afterthoughts, a few made-up words, sounds that convey alienness without meaning anything, a thin linguistic veneer over a story. J.R.R. Tolkien did it backwards. Tolkien was a professor of Anglo-Saxon and Middle English at Oxford. Languages were not a creative tool for him, they were his primary intellectual passion. He began building Elvish languages as a teenager, long before the first word of The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings was written. The stories came later, as a world for the languages to live in. He built 2 primary Elvish languages: Quenya, the High Elvish, comparable to Latin, ancient, formal, used for ceremony and poetry, and Sindarin, the Grey Elvish, the everyday language of the elves in the Third Age, the one spoken by Legolas, the one used in the films. Both languages are complete. They have their own phonological systems, their own grammar with irregular verbs and vowel mutations, their own writing systems, Tengwar script among others, their own historical evolution. Tolkien documented how Elvish changed over thousands of years in in-universe history, the way real languages change. He spent approximately 60 years refining them, constantly revising, often contradicting earlier notes. The corpus of Tolkien's linguistic work fills multiple scholarly volumes. Dozens of independent linguists have spent careers piecing together a consistent grammar from his incomplete notes. He wrote in a private letter that his stories were a secondary creation. What he was really doing was inventing mythology for the languages. The languages were primary. The mythology was context. Number 8. Klingon, the alien language with a dictionary and a Bible translation. 1984, linguist Mark Okrand was hired by Paramount Pictures to create an alien language for the Klingons in Star Trek III: The Search for Spock. He had one constraint. Some Klingon sounds had already been recorded in earlier films. He had to work backward from those sounds and build a complete language consistent with them. He used those constraints deliberately. He chose sounds and grammatical structures rare or absent in natural human languages. Retroflex consonants, uvular sounds produced deep in the throat. A word order, object, verb, subject, used by fewer than 1% of natural languages. A harsh, aggressive phonology designed to sound alien. Then something unexpected happened. People learned it. Seriously. The Klingon Language Institute was founded in 1992. It published a peer-reviewed journal. It commissioned a translation of the works of Shakespeare into Klingon, because in the Star Trek universe it is claimed Shakespeare is better in the original Klingon. It completed a translation of the Bible's New Testament.
Gilgamesh has been translated. Hamlet has been performed in Klingon on actual stages. There are people, a small but real number, who can hold extended conversations in Klingon. Weddings have been conducted in Klingon. At least one child was raised with Klingon as a significant language component in their early childhood. What Klingon demonstrated that no earlier Conlang had so clearly is that science fiction and popular culture are more effective at spreading a constructed language than any political or philosophical argument. Esperanto appealed to idealism. Klingon appealed to identity. Fan communities adopted it as a mark of belonging. The language became culture.
Number 7. Lojban, the language that tried to fix human thought. In 1955, a linguist named James Cook Brown proposed a hypothesis. Maybe the ambiguity and irrationality of natural languages causes humans to think imprecisely. Maybe a perfectly logical language would produce clearer, more rational thinking. He built one called Loglan, Logical Language. In 1987, a group of his followers took the work further and created a refined version. They called it Lojban. Lojban is designed to be completely unambiguous. Every sentence has exactly one grammatically valid parse. There are no irregular verbs, no gendered nouns, no exceptions to any rule. The grammar is defined by a formal syntax, like a programming language, where every sentence can be mechanically verified as grammatically correct or incorrect. It has no word order requirements. You can rearrange the words in a sentence in almost any order, and the grammatical markers tell you what each word is doing. Subject-verb-object relationships are indicated by particles, called tags, not by position. Lojban also has specific grammatical features human languages rarely or never have. A complete system for indicating how confident you are in what you are saying, whether your statement is based on direct observation, inference, reported speech, or speculation. Built into the grammar, required. You cannot make a claim in Lojban without grammatically marking your epistemic confidence in it. The cognitive hypothesis, that speaking Lojban makes you think differently, has never been definitively confirmed, but the language has a dedicated community, a corpus of original literature and translations, and has been studied by linguists and cognitive scientists as a test case for the relationship between language and thought. As of 2026, it has an active online community and Wikipedia presence.
Number 6. 137 words. That is the entire language. In 2001, a Canadian linguist and translator named Sonia Lang was going through a period of depression. She began asking herself, what is the minimum a language needs to function? What if you stripped away everything non-essential? Could you communicate complex thoughts with a radically small vocabulary? The result was Toki Pona, good language. In Toki Pona, 137 words. That is the complete vocabulary. Not a simplified vocabulary, the entire lexicon. Every concept that exists must be expressed as a combination of these 137 words. There is no word for computer. You might call it a fast-thinking machine. No word for hospital, a building where you fix broken people. No word for television, a light box that shows many things. This forces the speaker to constantly decompose complex ideas into their fundamental components. What is this thing at its most basic level? What does it do? What is it for? The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, the idea that the language you speak shapes how you think, is contested at the strong version but has real empirical support at a weaker version. Toki Pona is one of the few languages that allows an experiment in its most extreme form. Can you function with only 137 concepts? Can you communicate at all? The answer turns out to be yes. The Toki Pona community has grown continuously since 2001. Books have been written in it, songs recorded, poems composed, philosophy discussed. It has a Wikipedia equivalent. Sonia Lang's official Toki Pona dictionary was published in 2021 and has sold tens of thousands of copies. The language that was a personal experiment for mental clarity became a global community project.
Number 5. Solresol, a language made of music.
In 1827, a French musician named Jean-François Sudre proposed something entirely unprecedented, a language where every word is made of combinations of the 7 musical notes: do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si. Nothing else, no other sounds required. Solresol could be spoken, sung, played on any musical instrument, whistled, topped as a rhythm in Morse code style, shown with 7 colors, indicated by hand signals corresponding to the 7 notes. A completely deaf person could communicate in it using color. A completely blind person could speak it normally. A deaf-blind person could receive it through tapped rhythms on their hand. One single language, multiple transmission channels, all mutually compatible. It attracted serious attention in its time. Napoleon III's government awarded Sudre a prize for the invention. It was demonstrated at the Paris Expositions of 1855 and 1867. The French Academy of Sciences endorsed it. A full dictionary of approximately 2,668 words was eventually compiled. The system's logic was elegant. Words related in meaning were related in sound. All words beginning with do related to time. Words beginning with mi related to the human body. Sol words related to the arts and sciences. Within each category, the relationships were systematic, the entire vocabulary organized around the musical scale. Solresol never achieved widespread adoption. The complexity of learning a completely non-phonetic word system was a barrier, but no constructed language before or since has proposed a transmission system this flexible. It is the only language in history that can be equally spoken, sung, colored, and topped, and mean exactly the same thing in all 4 forms. Number 4. Na'vi. Built in 18 months, spoken by millions. In 2005, James Cameron hired linguist Paul Frommer at the University of Southern California to create a language for the alien Na'vi people in his upcoming film Avatar. Frommer had 4 years and a set of phonetic sounds Cameron had already decided on. He built Na'vi from those sounds, developing a complete phonology, including ejective consonants, sounds produced with a sharp burst of airflow not common in English, a grammar, and a vocabulary. Na'vi has features no natural language has. It allows you to specify with grammatical markers whether a group of people you are talking about includes exactly 2 individuals or more than 2, a dual plural distinction built into the noun system. When Avatar released in December 2009, it became the highest-grossing film in history, and something happened that Frommer did not entirely expect. The fans wanted to learn Na'vi, not casually, actually learn it. The Na'vi community, LearnNa'vi.org, and its successor platforms built learning resources, dictionaries, grammar guides. Frommer engaged with the community directly, publishing new vocabulary, answering grammar questions, expanding the language to meet the demand speakers created by wanting to talk about things the original film vocabulary did not cover. When Avatar: The Way of Water released in 2022, a further wave of learners arrived. As of 2026, Na'vi has tens of thousands of active learners on Duolingo and dedicated learning platforms. It is one of the fastest-spreading constructed languages in history, achieved in 4 years of professional construction what Esperanto took decades to reach. Number 3. Dothraki and High Valyrian, the languages that made Hollywood serious. Before Klingon and Na'vi, Hollywood constructed languages were, almost without exception, gibberish. Sounds arranged to feel alien or exotic with no underlying structure. Huddies in Star Wars, the alien speech in countless science fiction films. David J. Peterson changed that. In 2009, HBO hired Peterson, who had studied linguistics at UC San Diego and UC Berkeley, to create a real, speakable, grammatically complete language for the Dothraki in Game of Thrones. A nomadic, horse warrior culture needed a language that felt harsh, direct, and physical. Peterson built Dothraki with minimal politeness vocabulary, extensive terminology for horses in combat, and a grammar that reflected the culture's values. Then he was asked to create a second language for the same show, High Valyrian, the ancient, prestigious language of Old Valyria, the empire whose fall the show's history centers on. Peterson built it as a more classical, formal language, with a complex noun-case system, inflected, refined, the Latin to Dothraki's perhaps Anglo-Saxon.
Both languages were built to be actually spoken by actors. Peterson coached the cast on pronunciation. The languages had to hold up under dramatic performance, emotional dialogue, whispered threats, shouted commands. They did. Duolingo launched Dothraki and High Valyrian courses. High Valyrian became briefly one of the fastest-growing language courses on the platform. More people were learning High Valyrian than were learning several natural endangered languages. Peterson has since created languages for dozens of additional films and television productions. He has become the most prolific professional conlanger in history, having constructed over 100 languages. His work shifted an entire industry's approach to fictional language, from sound design to actual linguistics.
Number 2. Nicaraguan Sign Language, the conlang that nobody built. Children did it by accident. This entry is different from every other entry on this list because this language was not built by anyone. In 1979, the Sandinistas took power in Nicaragua and, as part of an education initiative, opened the first public school for deaf children in Managua, the Melania Morales Special Education Center. Deaf children arrived from across the country. Many of them had grown up in isolated households. They had developed home signs, idiosyncratic gestures for communicating with their hearing families, but they had never met other deaf people. They had never been exposed to a developed sign language. No one taught them a language. The teachers tried to teach them to lip-read Spanish. The attempts largely failed, but in the schoolyard, something else was happening. The children began combining their home signs, trading gestures, negotiating shared meanings. A crude pidgin emerged among the first cohort of students, enough to communicate, but inconsistent, lacking grammar. Then younger children arrived and began learning from the older ones, and something remarkable happened. The younger learners did not just learn the crude pidgin, they systematized it. They added grammar that was not there before. Complex spatial grammar, verb agreement, consistent word order, features that the original home signers had never used and that no one had taught. The younger learners were generating grammatical structure spontaneously from the communicative material around them. The way children absorb language and impose structure on it, even when adults have not. Within one generation, a fully grammatical language had emerged from nothing. Not constructed, not designed, generated by children's innate language acquisition machinery, working on whatever communicative material it could find. Steven Pinker called it the only time we have ever seen a language created out of thin air. Nicaraguan Sign Language is now a living language with thousands of speakers. It is taught in Nicaraguan schools. It has been the subject of landmark studies in linguistics, cognitive science, and neuroscience, and it proved something that all the deliberately constructed languages on this list could only approach from the outside. Language is not something humans learn. It is something human brains generate given the right conditions. The children did not copy a language, they grew one.
Number 1. The language of the future. What conlangs are becoming. Every language on this list was built by a person for a purpose in a specific historical moment. Something new is happening now. Large language models, the AI systems that underlie systems like the one writing and reading text, are trained on every human language simultaneously. They do not speak one language that they translate into others. They operate in a high-dimensional space where concepts exist prior to any specific linguistic expression. When they generate text in English, they are projecting from that conceptual space into English surface form. When they generate French, they project into French. This is, in a very specific technical sense, closer to what Lojban tried to do philosophically than anything Lojban actually achieved, a representation of meaning prior to specific linguistic form. Whether this constitutes a language in any meaningful sense is actively debated among linguists, philosophers of language, and AI researchers. It has no phonology, no community of speakers, no cultural context, no grammar in the traditional sense. It is not a conlang in any conventional definition, but the question it raises is the one every conlang on this list implicitly asked. What is the essential minimum of what a language needs to be? Hildegard asked it with a mystic vocabulary. Zamenhof asked it with a neutral grammar. Sonia Lang asked it with 137 words. Ockrand asked it with a deliberately alien phonology. The AI systems now producing fluent text in hundreds of languages simultaneously are producing an answer nobody designed, and linguists are still working out whether it is a new kind of language or a new kind of something else entirely.
12 constructed languages. A 12th century abbess building a secret vocabulary in a sleepless medieval scriptorium. A priest who claimed God visited him in a dream and who built a language so rigid it destroyed itself within a decade. The language that actually survived 2 million speakers, native children, over a century of world congresses. A professor who built his languages before his stories so the stories would have somewhere to live. An alien language with a Shakespearean Translation Society and a Bible. A logical language where you cannot make a claim without grammatically marking how certain you are. A language of 137 words that somehow said everything. A language made entirely of musical notes that could be spoken, sung, colored, or tapped. A language built in 18 months that millions of people chose to learn. 2 languages that changed what Hollywood thought a fictional language should be. A language that children created in a Nicaraguan schoolyard without any model, proving that the capacity for language is not learned but generated from inside. And the question none of them fully answered, what is language at the deepest level really doing? Every conlang ever built was an attempt to answer that question. None of them have gotten there yet, but they keep getting closer. Subscribe to Cosmic Hives. See you in the next one.